It's 2 p.m., so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome today to the joint webinar with DOE's Office of Electricity and the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. DOE is holding a webinar in conjunction with HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development, and in particular their Division of Disaster Recovery and Special Issues. Today's webinar is part of the 2020 CDBG-MIT webinar series. And I'd like to point out that today's webinar will be recorded. That recording, the slides, and transcript will be posted onto HUD Exchange at a later date. And anyone who hasn't muted their line, please do so now. Also, I'd like to point out that participants will be in a listen mode only. Please submit your content-related questions via the Q&A box. You should see that on the right side of your screen. Please submit your technical-related questions also via the Q&A box. And we will monitor those questions, particularly the content-related questions. Our presenters will look at those, and we will address the questions at the end of today's presentation. Your technical-related questions, if there's any issues with the webinar and you need some assistance, our host will monitor the Q&A box for technical questions and respond to you directly. With that, I'd like to thank Ms. Joshani Clemens for everything that she's done to support us with this 2020 CDBG-MIT webinar series. Thank you so much, Joshani, and would you like to take a moment to talk about the survey?
You're welcome. Thank you, Roosevelt. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. What Roosevelt was informing you of is a Level 1 survey. It is in the box entitled Click to Eval. If you click on that link, it will direct you to SurveyMonkey to complete it. If not, I will send you the link to you after this event and tomorrow. Another thing, like just few housekeeping things. To actually get a copy of the presentation today, you're going to click on that PDF in the box entitled File to Download. You're going to click on it, and the system will walk you through either you printing it out or saving it or even just following along with us. And I think that's everything, Roosevelt. Guys, just have a great meeting, and thank you.
Thank you again, Joshani. Today's webinar is titled Energy Infrastructure Resilience and Mitigation. We'd like to point out that this is our third DOE webinar. Our first DOE webinar occurred May 21st. The Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy spoke broadly about energy efficiency and renewable energy best practices. Last Thursday, we had the Building Technology Office in DOE come and speak to us with respect to energy efficiency and resilience in buildings. And also they talked about model codes and resilient building standards. So very helpful information presented through DOE. Again, our Office of Electricity and DOE, and then the Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response Office will be presenting a joint webinar today with HUD, and the title is Energy Infrastructure Resilience and Mitigation. I'd like to introduce our presenters today. First, we have Ms. Brandy Martin, who is with the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. In that office, Brandy focuses on energy security planning and emergency preparedness with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. Prior to joining the department in 2016, she served as the Partner Engagement Director at the Smart Cities Council, managing industry-leading energy and technology partners, and engaging city government leaders. She also has 7 years of experience in various roles at Cisco Systems. Thank you, Brandy, for joining us today. Next, we have Ms. Johanna Zeiderberg, who's with the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Electricity. Ms. Zeiderberg is an energy sector professional with over 10 years of experience at the U.S. Department of Energy, working with states and local governments on evolving energy priorities. In the Office of Electricity, she leads efforts to protect national security and defense activities against energy sector threats. One of our guest speakers today is Ms. Kenya Stump. Ms. Stump is with the Commonwealth of Kentucky Office of Energy Policy. Ms. Stump is the Executive Director of the Kentucky Office of Energy Policy, which utilizes Kentucky's energy resources for the betterment of the Commonwealth while protecting and improving the environment. The office addresses energy policy with a common sense approach that ensures that the Commonwealth thrives amid rapid changes occurring in the production, delivery, and use of energy. Thank you, Ms. Stump, for joining us today. We also have Ms. Jennifer Carpenter. Jen is the Assistant Director of Policy for the Disaster Recovery and Special Issues Division under CPD at HUD. In her 12 years at HUD, she has worked on various programs in CPD, including 6 years with the team responsible for managing the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. So thank you, Jen, for joining us today as well. My name is Roosevelt Grant. I'm with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and I'm completing a rotational assignment to Jen's policy team. And with that, I'd like to move forward with our agenda. So here's an overview of today's webinar presentation. First, we'll have a discussion on background for CDBG-MIT Purpose and Goals. We'll ask the question, why focus on energy? Our speakers from DOE and the Commonwealth of Kentucky will address Office of Electricity and Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response introductions. We'll have some project examples. Ms. Stump will talk about the Kentucky State Office of Energy. We'll wrap things up with a quick summary, provide you with some resources, and then have a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jen.
All right, thank you, Roosevelt, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I am just going to give you a brief background on CDBG mitigation, CDBG-MIT for short. We've been doing these slides at the beginning of all of our webinars just to give everyone some context, just in case you're not a grantee that currently has mitigation funding. We want to make sure everyone's on the same page on, the funding, the purpose of the funding, and some of the goals. So the mitigation grant, CDBG-MIT, is the unique funding source where there's a focus on carrying out strategic and high-impact activities to mitigate disaster risks and reduce future losses. First, all of the activities funded by CDBG-MIT must meet the definition of mitigation. Mitigation is defined in our Federal Register notice as activities that increase resilience to disasters and reduce or eliminate the long-term risk of loss of life, injury, damage to and loss of property, and suffering and hardship by lessening the impact of future disasters. In your mitigation needs assessment, which is part of your action plan for these funds, you're going to identify both current and future risks in your most impacted and distressed areas. Those areas are defined by HUD in the Federal Register notice, and then the state or local government grantee also defines their own most impacted and distressed areas. Third, an activity must be CDBG eligible or eligible through a waiver and alternative requirement published in a Federal Register notice. And last, all of your activities must meet a national objective. These national objectives include, for this notice, benefiting low and moderate income persons, We have a new national objective we've added to the mitigation grant that's called urgent need mitigation. There are additional requirements in the Federal Register notice associated with that national objective, and also the mitigation and national objective for covered projects. So both of those are new for mitigation. There are additional requirements that aren't normally in our CDBG DR program, so you want to make sure you check the notice for those requirements. All right, so to maximize the impact of the funds, there are a few goals that HUD has named in the Federal Register notice that we just want to go over and try to keep remembering as we walk through this presentation today. And really, as you put together, for the grantees that haven't put together action plans or in the process of doing that, just keep remembering these goals that HUD identified in the Federal Register notice. We'd like our grantees to rely on data-informed investments, build capacity to analyze and address disaster risks, as well as updating those hazard mitigation plans for their jurisdictions, supporting the adoption of policies that reflect both your local and regional priorities to have a long-lasting effect in risk reduction, and maximizing the impact of funds by encouraging leveraging and public-private partnerships. Grantees, in order to do this, grantees are strongly encouraged to coordinate and align your CDBG mitigation projects with other federal, state, and local mitigation projects. This webinar focuses on how you can align some of this work in the DOE sphere, and we'll be talking about the different kind of projects and hearing some best practices in that arena. This notice also the notice for mitigation continually puts focus on shared goals of mitigation to advance long-term resilience to current and future hazards, align those funds, as we mentioned previously, and promote planning efforts. So these are all things you want to consider for those grantees that are still in the development phase of putting together their action plan. So we pulled some things from the notice specific to the Energy Lifeline. For those of you familiar with the notice, you know that as part of the mitigation needs assessment, you really need to identify those needs through those community lifelines as they're defined in the notice. And one of those is through energy, right? Energy, power, and fuel. So we've just taken some of those references, put them here so you can just kind of tie the things we're talking about today back to the notice, back to your requirements, back to what needs to be in your action plan and the things you need to be thinking about. So you can read these. The mitigation needs assessment, one of the requirements is that you have to quantitatively assess the significant potential impacts and risk of hazards affecting those community lifelines that I mentioned, one of those being energy, power, and fuel. Energy efficiency infrastructure, this is one of the things we mentioned. Typical infrastructure mitigation programs may include regional investments and risk reduction for all hazards to develop disaster-resistant infrastructure, including energy infrastructure to address specific and identified risk. So through your mitigation needs assessment, you're identifying your risk, and then when you pick your programs and projects, you're then linking those programs or projects to the risks that you've identified in your mitigation needs assessment. So we're always going back to that analysis we did at the beginning to link your programs and projects back to that. So in this case, if you have these types of projects, you're linking them back to the needs that you identified in the lifeline related to energy. And then for covered projects, we have a covered project definition in the mitigation notice that revolves around these types of infrastructure projects. This includes infrastructure projects as defined as an activity or group of related activities that develop the physical assets that are designed to provide or support services to the general public in the following sectors, including energy production and generation, including from fossil, renewable, nuclear, and hydro sources, and electricity transmission. So there's a much longer definition in the Federal Register Notice about what a covered project is. This is a section that applies to these types of projects that we're going to be talking about today. With a covered project, it also comes with a dollar threshold. Once your projects reach that dollar threshold, there are additional requirements in the notice that you have to meet and respond to HUD and submit those through a substantial action plan amendment. HUD will then approve that. We'll review and approve based on the review of the substantial action plan amendment. All right, one last slide to talk about some things in the CDBG-MIT notice. We did want to bring up, and this is sort of perhaps the elephant in the room, and we just want to acknowledge it. We do have a prohibition on assistance to private utilities. For the last few years, we have had this prohibition in our Federal Register notices. Funds made available under this notice, in this case we're talking about CDBG-MIT, may not be used to assist privately owned utilities. However, a CDBG-MIT grantee that prioritizes a mitigation project where assistance to a privately owned utility is necessary may request a waiver of this prohibition. So in the CDBG-MIT notice, we specifically allow grantees to come in, request a waiver if you've identified those risks in your mitigation needs assessment. You have a project to mitigate those risks, to reduce disaster loss, then come in with that justification, explain the project to HUD, ask for a waiver, and we can go from there. You always, when you have a waiver request, you always want to reach out to your CPD grant manager, whoever that is, make sure you're having conversations with them early on in your planning process if you think you're going to need any type of waiver. You want to make those connections early so that you can have a conversation about what kind of justification or good cause is HUD looking for in your request. So make sure you're working through your grant manager in that case. All right, I believe I am turning it over to Johanna.
Hi, thank you, Jen. Actually, Brandy's going to start us off. Oh. Go ahead, Brandy. Hi, I'm Brandy. I'm with the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, or also known as CESER. We have the best acronym within DOE, gotta say. Johanna and I are really happy to be here and have the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I wanted to start off by just talking about the significance of energy. Energy is essential. It powers and fuels our lives and the economy, and many of the basic necessities, the daily things that we rely on. You see the photos of here, they all require energy. A disruption or physical or cyber attack on energy infrastructure could also affect other critical infrastructures such as hospitals, water, transportation, emergency services, and government operations. During the COVID-19 response, you likely saw the Department of Homeland Security's list of essential critical infrastructure workers. So this diagram shows the identified 16 critical infrastructure sectors that DHS has identified, but it's not at a worker level, it's at a sector level, and it shows the interdependencies across the different sectors. There are 4 designated lifeline functions. Those are all in red: energy, transportation, water, communications. These lifeline functions are so vital that a disruption or loss of the function will directly affect the security and resilience within and across all critical infrastructure sectors. So specifically for energy, Energy provides essential fuel to all of the critical infrastructure sectors, and without energy, none of them can operate properly. When we're talking about the energy sector, I just want to be clear about kind of what it does encompass. Obviously, electricity, I think, is what comes to people's mind first. It's both conventional and renewable sources, also natural gas, and then liquid fuels. So that's gasoline, jet fuel, propane, and heating oil. So at a high level, that's what the sector includes. The infrastructure itself is the assets, it's the equipment, the systems, the facilities, the network, and the other elements that you see here. So not surprising, the reason we're here today is that our nation's energy infrastructure and delivery systems are vulnerable to a variety of hazards. So this includes severe weather, hurricanes, flooding, tornadoes, earthquakes, and wildfires. It's also infrastructure failures, pandemics, and deliberate attacks and other events. DOE uses and recommends an all-hazards approach, which does include cybersecurity. States can work with energy providers and stakeholders to reduce the risks and vulnerabilities to energy infrastructure.
Thanks, Brandy. So that was a great introduction, and I'll continue the presentation here for a few minutes. We wanted to provide a little bit of background on the two DOE offices that Brandy and I are representing today. I think the important thing to know is that both of our offices support, as Brandy was just saying, addressing all hazards to critical energy infrastructure in order to mitigate disastrous consequences. And we work with state, local, tribal, territorial governments, industry, federal partners, and others to do that. Combined, our offices provide support for the grid and for critical energy infrastructure across the disaster preparedness cycle or timeline. So this includes prevention, protection, and preparation activities in anticipation of a potential disaster striking. It also includes life-sustaining response and restoration activities in the immediate aftermath of an event. And finally, it includes restoration and long-term recovery support activities to the critical energy infrastructure. So we wanted to provide you a bit of an illustration of what those missions mean in practice. So I will start off with a few key efforts that the Office of Electricity is leading now, and then Brandy will share the same for CESER. On disaster recovery support, OE provides this type of support to some of the nation's most vulnerable communities, from remote villages in Alaska to islands in the Pacific and Caribbean, in order to mitigate their exposure to energy disruptions. The 2017 hurricane season and the devastation experienced in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands revealed opportunities to enhance DOE's recovery support, which we're working to implement to lower the cost of future disasters and promote American energy resilience. Second, the Office of Electricity is creating the North American Energy Resilience Model, which we affectionately call NARM, to analyze a range of threat scenarios to U.S. energy infrastructure infrastructure and interconnected portions of the grid in Canada and Mexico. NARM is a tool designed to assess the behavior of electric power systems and associated dependencies on natural gas and other critical energy infrastructures, and other critical infrastructures beyond energy as well. So integration of industry data will enable unprecedented real-time situational awareness and sophisticated analytics to minimize the impact of threats as they continue to evolve in real time. Third, you may be aware that on May 1st of this year, President Trump signed an executive order called Securing the United States Bulk Power System, which the Office of Electricity is implementing. This order acknowledges that the bulk power system, which is the generation and transmission parts of our electricity system, is a target for malicious cyber activities, and that these threats constitute a national emergency in light of the role that the bulk power system plays in national defense, the economy, emergency services, and the U.S. way of life. It being the order, protects the bulk power system from compromise by prohibiting the installation of certain components and replacing existing components where there is a credible threat. And finally, defense critical electric infrastructure is defined in the Federal Power Act, and it can be thought of as a unique subtype of critical energy infrastructure that supports national defense and security activities. The Office of Electricity is leading the department's efforts to address needs in this space by managing risk and staying ahead of intensifying threats, working with key partners, including at all levels of government and with the private sector.
Okay, I'll just touch briefly on parts of what CESER does. We define energy security as ensuring a secure and reliable flow of energy across the nation. So this is achieved through planning and efforts to mitigate risks to the energy infrastructure, but also through planning for preparedness, responding and recovering from events. To help states and industry build capacity around this and to enhance their energy security planning, we develop tools, analysis, training, and exercises. CESER also executes the department's emergency support function ESF 12 under the National Response Framework. So you might be familiar with ESF structure. Each state has the ESF 12 responder as well. So we work very closely on emergency response with FEMA to help facilitate response to energy emergencies. And then I apologize if you hear a weird noise in the back of my line. It just started pouring outside my house, and there's some weird window pinging going on. Cybersecurity, of course, is also a large part of our portfolio. It's a really important part as well. So the frequency and scale and sophistication of cyber threats specific to the energy infrastructure is growing. Our goals on the cybersecurity side are to strengthen the energy sector cybersecurity preparedness, to coordinate cyber incident response and recovery, and accelerate the research and development of tools and technologies. And as I mentioned earlier, DOE does take an all-hazards approach. So we're looking at risks and hazards and threats, and we want to help states better understand these risks so they can be better prepared to make informed decisions about their investments, as well as resilience and hardening strategies. I know some of you on the phone we've probably worked with before, but in some cases we have not. So just wanted to note that within your state, we do work closely with quite a few different energy officials in both states and territories. So we engage with different roles, from governor's energy advisors to state energy officials, public utility commissions, across the board on the states. And we also work with industry, so we maintain a close relationship, mainly through the ESCC and ONG, SCC, with the mission of coordinating efforts to prepare for and respond to national level disasters or threats to critical infrastructure. All right, that was a little bit about OE and CESER. We're happy to take more questions, kind of dive more into what we do. We do cover quite large portfolios, but we did try to kind of keep it high level and narrow for today. We're going to review a very, very high level some energy mitigation projects that you could consider. Some of the projects that we're going to cover, DOE helped fund, others that we didn't. And as John mentioned, we're happy to have follow-up calls and to go into more details on any of these projects or to facilitate introductions. So if you want to talk to a state or utility who has completed some of these projects and hear a little bit about their experience, we're happy to facilitate those connections. One of the common things people think about with mitigation is infrastructure hardening. So this is referring to physically changing an energy asset to make it less susceptible to damage from extreme wind or flooding or flying debris. And hardening improves the durability and stability of the infrastructure, making it better able to withstand the impact without having major damage or failure. And I just wanted to level set, knowing that we, not everybody in the phone might have an energy focus. The top right-hand corner, we talk about transmission and distribution. That's how kind of energy is flowing, electricity is flowing. So on the top right-hand, these are transmission. These are the big towers. Typically, this is the investor-owned utility, so it is the private utilities that was brought up earlier, where if you are going that route with some of your projects, that would require that waiver. On the other hand, distribution, so that's on the poles on the lower right side. These are the distribution, typically what you're going to see at the residential neighborhood level or businesses, communities. When you're thinking about projects, you can look at LMI communities or neighborhoods specifically for that set of infrastructure projects. So one of the transmission and distribution infrastructure is mostly damaged by hurricane-force winds. So specific for distribution systems, hardening typically includes upgrading wind poles. It could be to concrete or steel, installing other types of structural supports. You can also see a photo of the undergrounding lines or burying the power lines. So this is placing utility lines underground to eliminate the susceptibility to wind damage and lightning that they can experience above or overhead lines when they're above ground. And our guest speaker from Kentucky, I think, will touch a little bit on this as well. Not shown on the slide, but we did want to mention that flood hardening or flood protection is also an option. So elevating equipment, we saw a lot of substations be elevated after Superstorm Sandy, or in some cases we've heard of some states looking to potentially relocate some facilities to areas that are less likely to flood or are in a less severe earthquake zone.
Thanks, Brandy. So continuing along with potential project ideas or areas for exploration, I want to talk a little bit more about energy infrastructure that is critical to national defense and security. Threats to U.S. national security through the energy sector continue to intensify, including those identified in the 2019 Worldwide Threat Assessment and the 2020-2022 national counterintelligence strategy. More frequent and extreme weather events, aging and outdated energy infrastructure, and cyber and physical attacks from determined adversaries can impact domestic military installations, which are connected to the civilian electric grid. In addition to defending the homeland and projecting power abroad, U.S. military bases support domestic response services to state and local emergencies. You can see in the lower right, I think that was Hurricane Matthew there. Hardening electric infrastructure serving military installations has benefits at every level, at the community level, at the state and regional levels, and at the national level. If you have a military installation or more than one in your jurisdiction and are interested in exploring mitigating disaster risk to this very unique type of critical energy infrastructure, please do contact me and follow up to today's webinar. I would love to speak with you further and see how we can assist. Moving on to backup power. I think we're all familiar with the need for backup power generation depending on the threats that we face. DOE has several offices, none with as good of an acronym as Brandy has in CESER, but they do have missions specific to advancing individual technology types that can provide electricity generation during a power outage. And as we keep mentioning, Brandy or I would be delighted to connect you with experts from those offices who have expertise to bear at the technology level, if it would be helpful for you in navigating any options related to backup power coming from specific technologies. So they can assist on technical requirements, on reviewing the potential options and suitable approaches given whatever your jurisdiction's energy policy framework or other needs would be. I did want to mention just what a microgrid is in case that is a new term for anyone today. A microgrid is basically a local energy grid that can be disconnected from the main grid and operate as its own island, powered by generating resources that are directly connected to it. And we'll keep moving through these project ideas here. Another one is low-income backup power. So in Washington, D.C., Jubilee Housing, which is an affordable housing services provider, partnered with the local utility, which was PEPCO, under a program of the D.C. Department of Energy and the Environment to design a rooftop solar array combined with a battery storage system that provides a resiliency center capable of powering a community space within this building for 3 days during power outages. This provides refrigeration for medication and perishables, lighting, outlets for charging cell phones and other communication devices, and a television. This project reduces the utility burden of 100 Jubilee households by $40 to $50 a month for the next 15 years, allowing those households to put the savings toward other crucial necessities. This was DC's first of its kind effort to channel the benefits of solar plus storage to low-income housing residents who most severely feel the impact of energy outages. Next, we have the Montgomery County, Maryland microgrids, public purpose microgrids. which allow key facilities in the county to operate without any power from the utility grid, ensuring public safety and the continuity of public services during major electric distribution system outages from storms and other disasters. And the county has unfortunately had a history of experiencing major storms. The microgrids include clean energy technologies such as solar panels, combined heat and power systems, batteries, and advanced controllers that include built-in cybersecurity. And I think, Brandy, over to you for the next one.
Yep. I'm actually going to go back just for 1 second. So I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I remember some of those outages years ago. But I think that's also a good example to note on the inclusion of cybersecurity, right? So we encourage.
Thank you, Johanna and Brandy. I am Kenya Stump. I'm with the Kentucky Office of Energy Policy, and I'm so glad to be with you today to talk about our perspective on hazard mitigation and energy resilience.
What they're going to do from an IT, but potentially from an
As stated earlier, our office's mission is to support the utilization of Kentucky's energy resources for the betterment of the Commonwealth while protecting and improving our environment. Central to that mission is our role in energy assurance for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. One of our central goals, as I said, is energy assurance. We take it a little further in that one of our goals we've established for ourselves in our office is to enhance the energy resilience and security of the Commonwealth by identifying opportunities to increase our ability to respond effectively to an energy disruption and to recover quickly, along with maintaining the uninterrupted supply of energy resources to the Commonwealth at affordable prices. I know a lot of you on the call today may be unfamiliar with state energy offices. I'd like to take this opportunity to encourage you to reach out to your state energy office. Most energy offices throughout the nation do have a focus on energy assurance and planning efforts. They also are a host of resources in terms of technology options, funding resources, as well as data on your energy infrastructure that you may be looking at for your own state or even at your critical facilities. So I see this webinar as an opportunity to also establish a way that CDBG-MIT applicants can also maybe coordinate with their energy office, and we'll see maybe how the two can work together.
A massive earthquake could.
So I'd like to go through. This is a picture in Kentucky, and go through our risk profile. This was 2009. We had a significant ice storm in Kentucky that paralyzed the majority of our state. And since 2009, we've had a lot of experience with lessons learned from this and other disasters and specifically recently we had experience with a large power outage during our pandemic response, which also highlighted some additional vulnerabilities that we'll be addressing as we move forward as well. When you have a large portion of your population being what we call healthy at home, and then the power goes out, it highlights potential vulnerabilities that you may not have realized before under other hazard scenarios.
to fuel during emergencies.
So when we look at our hazard frequency in the state, there are 4 that really come to mind. We are subject to flooding, major severe storm events. That was the one that actually affected us during our pandemic response. We had a severe thunderstorm coupled with heavy rains that created issues for our power sector. Of course, tornadoes, we're not immune to tornadoes as well here, and extreme winter cold and storms, as you just saw with our ice storm. So from the Energy Office perspective, we look throughout our state and look at what hazards that our state is prone to. Last year, we also did a large tabletop exercise, Shake and Fury. Luckily, we haven't had an experience with an earthquake, but we do have a significant potential for an earthquake here in Kentucky as well. So we're preparing for that as well. And we are seeing more extreme heat and extreme cold events, along with more frequent severe thunderstorms. Our energy infrastructure, we are fortunate in the state of Kentucky that we have a robust energy infrastructure that is quite diverse. We have over 43 miles of pipeline infrastructure that includes natural gas, hydrocarbon liquids, and hazardous liquids. We do have natural gas storage areas as well, and the associated compressor stations and processing plants throughout our state. On the fuel side, we are fortunate that we have 2 oil refineries within our state, along with biofuel plants, and we have an ethylene cracker in western Kentucky that supports our chemical industries in the west. With that significant refinery footprint, we have 21 product terminals that resulting in over 2,500 fuel distributors, including over 240 propane distributors. On the electricity side, we are a hub. We see ourselves as a hub. We connect north, south, east, and west. When we look at our transmission capacity, over 10,000 miles of electric transmission lines, over 1,700 substations. And we also have quite a diversity in our power plants. We are what we call a regulated state. We have utilities that operate in wholesale markets, as well as our municipals and some utilities that are not part of any kind of market, along with our federal partner, the Tennessee Valley Authority. We have quite a diverse power perspective in the state, and I think that shows how that can be an asset to us when we have that kind of diversity in Kentucky. But on to mitigation. So in Kentucky, our traditional energy sector mitigation measures, when we look at what traditionally we funded, is very similar to what and Brandy and Johanna spoke of. Have a lot of experience with backup power supply. Our utilities, where prudent, have gone in for approvals for undergrounding. We're seeing a lot of utility pole replacement, wooden poles to stronger supports. One measure that's often overlooked is vegetation management. When we look at one of the #1 reasons where we see power outages, it's on the distribution system, and a lot of that is due to vegetation. So vegetation management is also a critical mitigation activity for us. And then, as mentioned, flood proofing of critical infrastructure, raising structures, as mentioned with substations, securing tanks for those flood-prone areas, and then building berms or flood walls around those critical infrastructure assets. When we look across our state, where we're seeing what we're calling emerging energy sector mitigation solutions, I'm going to start with distributed energy resources. When we say distributed energy resources, we include things like energy efficiency, distributed generation, like rooftop solar, combined heat and power facilities, demand response, anything that can respond to a signal at the distribution level that can control or conserve energy. So electric vehicles could be included in that as well if it's electric vehicles to grid solutions. And also connected buildings would play into the distributed energy resources. As mentioned, we do have experience with microgrids. We also use the term resilience hubs or community enclaves. That's a way of talking about a region that might explore microgrids and we'll get in a little bit more about resilient hubs later in the presentation. I realize you all heard a previous presentation on energy efficiency and building for resilience. We see that as an emerging area in terms of codes and resilient codes, and how do we enable affordable housing renovations that are more resilient. Smart grid improvements, that's a big topic, a big term. When I speak of smart grid, I'm speaking of things such as advanced metering infrastructure, which allows a lot of remote sensing of the electrical grid, and even you can have advanced metering infrastructure on the water side as well. Increased SCADA penetration, that's just more visibility into your substations and remote sensing of your grid system. Automatic switching of circuits and reconfiguration, this would allow your grid to sense and then reconfigure itself during an event. And for your critical facilities, a simple but often overlooked area is having dual feeds from the grid into critical facilities and redundant systems. We're also in the state looking at regional refueling centers and fuel diversification as mitigation solutions as well. So I'm going to go through a few projects and examples. Not all of these were funded out of the Energy Office, but it gives you a flavor of the types of projects that we would look at in terms of energy resilience, and maybe spur some creative thinking when you're looking at your own state and what you have available to you there. So I like to begin with a vision. If I look, this is an example of a project we do at the Energy Office. If I look at GIS and I look at what I'm calling all of our critical facilities, this meaning, fire, law enforcement, water supply, wastewater, healthcare, correctional facilities. And if we look at a density map, you can see some naturally occurring what we're calling areas of our state that could be energy resilient hubs. This is a good place to start for us at the state level when we're looking at resilience planning efforts. So how do we support these regions of our state to become more energy resilient and be able to withstand an energy and a long-term energy disruption? The state as a whole could become more resilient if we look at having these regional hubs that can support the community lifelines in these areas of our state. So that's sort of our vision as we move forward. One way we do that, of course, you mentioned microgrids. Fort Knox, since the 2009 ice storm, Fort Knox is a major facility with DOD in terms of the operations and what they support. Fort Knox, as a result of the ice storm, set themselves on a path to develop a microgrid. Their microgrid involves solar, geothermal, energy efficiency, building automation, along with combined heat and power. So they're also very fortunate, and they have their own gas supply, which also makes them more resilient when they have access to their own fuel supply as well. You can see here some of the quotes. I think it sums it up very nicely. Fort Knox sees themselves as, if they can lessen the load on the community, then that makes it easier for the utility to respond when there is a major event. Every year, Fort Knox disconnects and tests their emergency microgrid. They did one just last year, and I've linked to the article on that, but it's something to see. Fort Knox takes the entire base offline, and within 12 minutes they can have the entire facility back online and running independent of the grid. Our second project is actually through U.S. Green Building Council and Green Building Certification, Inc. We actually use their certifying framework. It's called PEER, Performance Excellence in Electricity Renewal. This certifies resilience of a power system. And we had 3 certifications in Kentucky, obviously Fort Knox being one of those, given that they were already an emergency microgrid, but we were also able to do a certification with our electric cooperative and a municipal electric organization, the City of Glasgow. This was able to basically allow a evaluation framework of the resilience of the power systems, and Nolan Rural Electric was the first cooperative in the nation to be certified under that framework. It's a great tool for analysis for power systems, and it can highlight vulnerabilities as well as highlight opportunities of how you can make your power system more resilient. And if you would like more information on PEER, I give the link there, and there's also a link to our video on our project. If you're familiar with LEED certification for buildings, PEER is the LEED version, but for power systems focused on measuring and evaluating resilience. Building for resilience. This is a project coming out of our office. We're working with affordable housing groups on how to build affordable housing units more resilient with different techniques, and to get their volunteers and construction crews trained on these techniques. Structural insulated panels. We're working with Kentucky Habitat for Humanity, and they recently completed a project for a veteran housing project using what we call SIP. SIPs enable more increased energy efficiency, but also add to the resilience of the structure in terms of wind and tornadoes. So we see that as a win-win for our affordable housing groups. COAP Inc. is an Eastern Kentucky housing organization, and they're also wanting to explore building with SIPs, and we provided funding to train them on SIP construction. Insulated concrete forms. This Morgan County storm shelter is built with ICF in Kentucky. ICF is recognized as one of the building techniques that enhances resilience in structures, and we're also providing education and training on that as well. We're doing Energy Star certification on affordable housing units, as well as construction job training for those coming out of addiction recovery, and how to move workforce development into kind of the energy sector, and tackling the struggles that we have with addiction in parts of our state. Relating to schools, as of January 1st, 2019, all new schools are required to provide a storm shelter large enough for the school's occupants. This storm shelter in Morgan County was built with ICF, and we see that as a great way to complete, to meet that requirement for our schools. This is an example of West Liberty, Kentucky. On March 2nd, 2012, we had a EF3 tornado rip through this community in Kentucky. What's interesting about this is the community itself decided that to rebuild itself with 21st century, lower cost, sustainable infrastructure and develop a path to create job-producing business opportunities, increase the tax base, and attract new residents. They did this with a whole host of solutions, including affordable housing and geothermal applications, LEED certification of commercial businesses, solar on some of their affordable housing locations. They have an energy efficiency education dashboard that can identify where energy is being utilized and how, and identify areas of the community. So this is a great example of rebuilding back for resilience in West Liberty, Kentucky. Here's an example that's very relevant to our pandemic response. Senior living facilities and healthcare were a critical area of need in our COVID-19 response. This Ivy Knoll Senior Retirement Community in Covington, they were able to use what we call PACE financing to address energy efficiency projects. And we see this as also resilience in that it's helping the facility remain operational, but then also meeting the comfort needs of residents. And we saw that as a critical area, as other states did as well during the COVID-19 response. Similar, we have a great example here of Norton Healthcare, Audubon. They were able to do a lot of efficiency that speaks to resilience. If the hospital is financially healthy and operationally sound, then that really contributes to the overall resilience of our healthcare system, and as well as being able to meet the needs of the patients. The energy efficiency measures taken at Norton Healthcare Audubon was essential for them to be able to add additional capacity, but also save utility costs and improve their operations. They did this through building automation. They did a hybrid energy plant that combines gas air-cooled chillers with thermal storage. And all of these together make Norton Healthcare Audubon Hospital more resilient. Smart grid. We have just some fast facts. 40% of the meters in Kentucky are considered advanced metering infrastructure. 10% of our circuits in Kentucky have voltage optimization. We recently, one of our cooperatives received a USDA grant to do additional smart grid technologies, and we do see smart grid as an evolving mitigation measure, as well as it allows for more remote sensing and efficiency on the supply side, as well as ability to sense and dispatch measures more quickly than traditional grid technologies would allow. All of that said, I know we're here today to talk about CDBG-MIT funding, but when I look at resilience from the perspective of the Kentucky Energy Office, it really, it's a funding puzzle that you have to piece together. I think HUD, CDBG are obviously a part of the puzzle, but we have private sector investment from our utilities and our private energy sector partners. You have private foundations, FEMA's traditional mitigation funding, As I mentioned in this presentation, USDA rural development, innovative financing opportunities such as PACE financing and energy savings performance contracting. Our office, we do projects through the state energy program funding. Of course, most states also have weatherization programs, your utility investments that may be coming through your public service commissions. And then recently here, we now have the CARES Act funding coming down into our affordable housing organizations as well, and seeing how we can leverage CARES Act funding to also address the needs of those who need it the most during this pandemic, but also hopefully add a little bit more resilience to the system. I will say this, we're working with the Smart Electric Power Alliance to evaluate microgrid opportunities, back to that begin with a vision. With our resilience hubs, we're looking to see what the feasibility is for microgrid solutions throughout our state. That's a project we're working on. We're also working on to utilize our reclaimed mine lands as potential sites for solar projects, and maybe solar plus battery that could support grid resilience as well. And today's presentation really was just to give you a
Thanks so much, Amanda. That's great. You guys are quite busy. Got a lot of projects going on in the state, and it sounds like you're leading the way on some of the approaches you're taking. So thanks so much. I want to just touch briefly, kind of when you're thinking about what projects might make sense from an energy standpoint of the resources you already have within the state. So all states and territories have energy assurance plans. Some of the data that Kenya referenced about historical outages and risk profiles and what your current infrastructure looks like, what is the landscape and what assets do you have, what equipment do you have, what is, that should all be included in that plan. So it's definitely a good place to start and to look at that energy assurance plan. And then just a few other examples, a lot of states are putting together resilience plans or climate plans, which aren't specific to energy, but often include energy in there. So take a look at those. And then state comprehensive energy plans, sometimes they're called action plans, but this is typically a little bit larger, long-term looking, and they've outlined different strategies to become more resilient, more reliable, and potentially other alternatives or energy projects that might already kind of been designed or scoped out. We don't have a picture up here, but I also wanted to just mention that lots of states have petroleum shortage response plans. So that's one other thing you might want to go and take a look at. No.
Thank you, Brandy, or whoever is advancing the slides. So we just wanted to share this example from North Carolina. Earlier this month, North Carolina released its Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan, which is a statewide effort covering hazards, vulnerabilities, and risks for 11 critical infrastructure sectors. And so the energy sector is discussed in Chapter 5L, if you would like to take a look at it and follow up to today's webinar. This is the first step in a long-term strategy and a framework that the state can use to guide state action, engage policymakers and stakeholders, and facilitate collaboration across the state. And I thought that this table was a nice way to take a look at these different elements of the of critical energy infrastructure that Brandy had mentioned earlier on, and do an assessment of their vulnerability to these different types of threats and hazards. And so I think this is a good example of how strategies that the state is coming up with link back to the Energy Lifeline needs assessment that they did, which is what Jen had discussed at the beginning of this webinar for HUD CDBG-MIT approaches as well. Before we move into more discussion, we thought that it might be useful to just pose some thought-provoking questions that you may like to consider, wrestle with, talk with your colleagues about. Have you determined which energy infrastructure is critical to mitigating disaster risks and reducing future losses? Where you are, have you conducted a vulnerability or risk assessment of that critical energy infrastructure, including impacts if vulnerabilities are left unaddressed? Have you developed energy resilience strategies? These are sort of foundational questions that are maybe a good summary of a lot of the material that we have presented today, and hopefully will give you some good food for thought as you move forward. Roosevelt, are we going back to you now?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to really thank Brandy, Johanna, Kenya, and of course Jen for all of the great information that they provided us today. Really appreciate the joint webinar here from the Office of Electricity and then the Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response Office as well, and working in conjunction with the Disaster Recovery and Special Issues Division and the Policy Unit to put this together. Again, Jen talked about the importance of addressing current and future risk, and this presentation today looked at how opportunities for aligning that CDBG-MIT purpose and goals with the DOE space, and then looking at potential funding opportunities to protect critical energy lifelines. With that, wanted to talk a little bit about the value of energy resilience and action plans and meeting CDBG-MIT goals. Jen spoke about the 4 primary goals for the CDBG-MIT program. Here we have supporting data-informed investments, addressing rent-loss properties, and protecting critical infrastructure. So again, the information from Kenya and Brandy and Johanna talked about various energy infrastructure resilience activities, examples including battery storage. For her goal number 2, looking at building capacity to comprehensively analyze disaster risk and updating your mitigation plans. So Kenya, I believe, spoke to energy planning and using that to promote energy assurance. Jen spoke to the importance of the mitigation plan, and in particular the hazard identification and risk assessment component of that MIT plan to feed into the baseline, if you will, for your mitigation needs assessment. Kenya spoke to the Kentucky Energy Sector Profile.
Yes, this is Kenya. I'll follow on.
And we had discussions
we have some
Brandy
examples in our state where
CESER program,
we've
including
leveraged, it may not be CDBG-MIT funding, but CDBG funding in partnership with our Energy Savings Performance Contracting. I think this is a great space to really talk to a lot of times your utility. Your utility has done a lot of resilience planning in terms of, and I'm speaking in terms of the power sector. They have a lot of insights to share of how to, once you identify critical facilities, and I say critical facilities, I mean a broader view of critical facilities among all the lifelines. Your utilities can really talk to you about, well, what are projects you can do to support those utilities, support those critical facilities. It may be your water or wastewater plant or your, your healthcare facility.
Goal number 4.
So I do think holistic planning, we just completed what we call an energy assurance planning toolkit for local governments, local communities, with the eye on looking at critical facilities and the energy needs of the critical facilities. I would start by asking that question. What are your critical facilities? What are those critical facilities in terms of ensuring your community lifelines? And what are their energy needs? And are there any gaps? And how would, and you really have to ask what happens when the power is out, or what happens when the fuel supply is disrupted.
And then we have examples of,
we found out during the pandemic most of our hospitals only have 3 days of fuel supply.
So this is a very
2 to 3 days of fuel supply. If you're beyond 2 or 3 days of fuel supply, you have a fuel supply plan.
And again,
so one question usually leads to more questions, but that's part of what we mentioned earlier, this overall strategic
and also Kenya
kind of view of looking at your critical facilities and the energy infrastructure that supports those facilities, and then asking what can you do under this particular funding, knowing that there are other funding sources out there that can complete the picture, kind of complete the puzzle. So, we focused on affordable housing in that It does double duty when you do efficiency and resilient building techniques. You get a checkbox in energy efficiency, but also you meet that resilience criteria of mitigating against, the threat of tornadoes or high winds. So, a lot of the times you might be able to find one solution that checks a number of different boxes. So that's a few thoughts I have from the state perspective. I also would encourage you to talk to the utility, talk to your energy office, and work with your those who are doing your mitigation planning at the local level, your emergency response planning. That's where you can really kind of start to get this more holistic picture.
I have the program requirements that Jen spoke to at the beginning for the mitigation program requirements and the purpose and background. We also have the webinar series that we published last year, fall of last year, that contains a lot of useful cross-cutting requirements connected to the CDBG-MIT program. Here's some information and links for the Office of Electricity, and then also connected to the CESER program. Again, Brandy and Johanna spoke to those respectively, and we thank them again for supporting us today. If you have questions that are not answered today and you'd like to submit those, here's a email address, DRSI Policy Unit at HUD.gov. Again, that's DRSI Policy Unit at HUD.gov. And with that, I'd like to initiate our Q&A session here. We're running out of time here, so we're going to keep it brief. The first question that I'd like to pose to the panelists is, can CDBG-MIT funds be used for energy efficiency improvements?
Hi, yeah, this is Jen. So in the case of energy efficiency, we did our previous webinars. Roosevelt mentioned the resources that are there available with DOE that we did. But again, for us, any sort of is this activity eligible? We always focus on what's the CDBG eligibility category, and then does it meet a national objective? And in this case, we have these additional criteria in the MIT notice. Does it meet the definition of mitigation? And then we have even, we have additional national objectives in the notice that we can meet. So you want to always make sure that you're going through that sort of checklist in your head. Is it eligible in the CDBG program? Usually energy efficiency improvements to a home can be part of an eligible rehab activity. So I think the key here is just bringing it back to mitigation. How are you meeting that definition with those types of activities? But it could certainly be part of sort of a holistic rehabilitation program, or if you're doing a new construction program, and focus, the benefits to the homeowners and reducing those energy costs, and how that plays into, how the whole development is, the costs are necessary and reasonable. That's always also a key you want to bring into any program design when you're thinking about those kind of activities.
Okay, thank you, Jen. Does anyone else want to chime in on that? Okay, not hearing any. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, from a allowability perspective, I think Jen covered it, but definitely think when you're looking at energy projects, it's good to be a little bit comprehensive and think holistically, as Kenya mentioned. So energy efficiency, always kind of including that, cybersecurity, kind of embedding those parts into the projects you design.
Okay, thank you so much. With that, the second question that I'd like to ask is, could the panel talk about potential eligibility for some of the activities that were discussed today on today's presentation related to CDBG-MIT?
Yeah, this is Jen again. Most of the activities we're talking about, the types of activities in general that we're talking about in today's presentation, would fall under the category and CDBG of public facilities and improvements. So this is
To join